Hello, and welcome to a new session of the Esade Stay Connected platform. Today, we have the great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Joaquim Levy. Dr. Levy has a very impressive CV. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago and has been, among other positions, finance minister in Brazil, president of the Brazilian Development Bank, as well as managing director and World Bank Group CFO. The purpose of today's conversation with Dr. Levy is to learn about what can we expect in the next normal of the post-COVID-19 world. This conversation has been organized by the Esade MBA Latin American Business Club and will be managed by three of our brilliant MBA students, Maria Clara Guedes de Castro, Victor Paz, and Andrei Gostinsky. Good afternoon, Dr. Levy.
You hear me?
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm really excited about this possibility of being talking to you. I hope that you all safe in the different places of the world, but of course, observing all the actions that you have to do in this very special time. But ultimately, I wish you all be okay, and you can have here a great opportunity to exchange a few views. We are living in a situation that is very unique in a way. I think for the last century, very seldom we had a situation like this. Some have compared with a war in the sense that we don't have a solution at hand, which will require great effort and probably a lot of government intervention to realign things. I think what makes COVID so different, especially when you compare with our experience in the last, 50 years, is what I mentioned. We don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure, so we have just to take precautions, and you have to change our lifestyle quite dramatically. For those who are in Spain, of course, we followed everything that happened, but in every other country, from India to Canada and to Brazil, we're living this time. And populations have to trust their government, which is sometimes something difficult these days. So it's also an additional challenge. I think that COVID will change a lot of things. It more than anything, it has accelerated and exacerbated a number of situations, of processes that were already developing, but with the crisis became much more intense. I think that some things will come back, some will never come back. Will be different forever. We all hope that we'll be able to find friends, go to restaurants, get together. I think this is really at the heart of our experience, our human beings, and it's so important. And of course, a country like Spain is everything about life is related to that. There will be differences. We may be careful for a while, but I think that the way to go. And here, I would say that there are two things where, especially in the short term, there will be a lot of questions, which is consumer confidence, and also how relations with the isolation will change behaviors. We hope that people will not become more suspicious or anything like this, but there will be changes. Let me start with something that, of course, I don't have to elaborate very much in Spain, which is tourism. I think traveling is something that will change a lot because it's the kind of things that you have a lot of connections. So it's hard to travel with almost every country. You'll be something between say 5 to up to 20% of GDP, if not in direct, say, revenues, through all the multipliers. In the case of Spain, I'm told that visitors, 80 million visitors, bring about $150 billion.
Sorry, Dr. Levy. I apologize for this interruption, but it seems that we have some video issues with you right now. Excellent. Thanks so much.
It's, I don't know. Okay.
Yes, no
keep
problem.
touching. It disappears. But so I was talking about tourism and some of the numbers in tourism and how part of this will come back, perhaps not mass tourism like we saw in some places, but I'm sure that it's something that you come. Although we're going to see changes also in commercial aviation, the whole sector was already trying to improve their record in terms of emissions, carbon emissions. But I think in spite of all the financial challenge that the sector will face, the pressure to continue to improve this area will continue. I think the changes in business travel will be even more important because there, everything that you learn about the possibility of meetings through the internet, everything that we're doing right now, I didn't have to go to Spain to talk to you. All of this will change quite dramatically. And it's not that bad. There was a lot of inefficiency, there was a lot of emissions when in this type of travel. I think that we can get more productivity with less travel in this area. The other area, of course, where changes will be dramatic, they are already being dramatic, is everything related to retail. Now, e-commerce was already becoming an important part of the economy. Retail is about 6% of GDP in the case of the US. And if you take the value of the sales, is a much larger part of GDP. E-commerce was growing fast. The US is not the country where you have this more developed. If you take China, if you take a number of the countries, you could say that e-commerce is around about 15% and probably reach 20% of value of sales pretty soon. And I'm not talking about tickets, travel, events, theater, these kind of things, where most is done already through the internet. So it just happens that retail hires a lot of people the same way that a restaurant and so on. So this would have an impact, especially to the so-called non-skilled labor. And it's not surprised that the new generations are so much concerned about these changes. If you look at the millennials, if you think at the Z generation, there is a lot of concern. And this generation can really be a little bit like those who were born 120 years ago, say in 1880, where through their lifetimes, they saw changes that, for instance, my generation has not seen. When you think where people were just using horses and maybe have heard about telegraph in the 1880s, and then where they were in 1930s, it's a very different world. And a world with a lot of challenges, including wars, etc. I hope this will not happen this time. We will have a much brighter situation, but the risks are there. And the generation, your generation, is very much aware of this. So I think that when you look at these events, these changes, these rapid changes, I think there are three main vectors. One is what is going to happen with labor, income security, and especially how you share the gain in productivities. I've been able to talk to you, not spending 3 days to do that, but just a few hours. It's a gain in productivity. It means I can do more. And a lot of other people can do more in a number of other jobs. The doctor that can respond to an answer to a patient, not having to travel to the patient, or the patient is spending 3, 4, 5 hours just for 15 minutes with the doctor. This is a gain of productivity. How we share that? I can develop this later, but it's a fundamental question, and I'm sure you're all aware about this. A second question is how the AI that is changing the jobs is also changing our life in terms of freedom, in terms of intromission of big companies as well as the government in our lives, knowing everything that you do. Many years ago, some of you have heard about him probably. There was Marshall McLuhan. He was a Canadian philosopher and a student of communication. He was the guy who invented this phrase, "we're a global village." And the idea at that time was that we all know about things that are happening around the world at the same time. So if the men go to the moon, which was the big thing at that time, everybody was watching this, or if there's a revolution, so on. But I think that the sense of a global village has changed in a way. Now we are in a village in a sense that everybody knows what you were doing. It's not what is happening to others, but the fact that a lot of people know what you're doing. If any of you have lived in a small town or a village, the main characteristic is that everybody knows with whom we're going out, or with whom we're talking, when you're meeting or doing, and so on and so forth. Now we are in a post-1984 world where many people know everything that you do. I have an Alexia, little instrument that my daughters have bought at home, and often we talk about something at the kitchen where it stays, and 2 days later, or even less than this, we get a lot of advertisement about things that you just toss it in the air. My wife gets very upset, and I tell the girls why they don't pull out the thing. But compared with the TV that would watch people in this book, George Orwell's books of 1984, I think that the old TV was much more timid than Alexa, that hears and knows everything that you're doing. So I think this is the second big question. Is a huge change comparing the 19th to the 20th century, where even in the most authoritarian regimes, even where you have police, secret police, or even where when your neighbor would tell the authorities what you're doing, nothing compares with what we have now, and I'm sure you've read about this. And then, of course, the third big question is climate, and how we're moving to a crisis that could be much worse than the COVID, and how we address that. It's possible, but we require a lot of changes, especially in the way economies are organized. In Europe, thanks to a lot of preparations, I think that we may use the situation now, the occasion now, to address some of these issues. If the stimulus packages are really designed, taking into consideration an ambitious, forward-looking approach. And this will be very important because the three axes, they are interconnected. If you get a good forward-looking stimulus package, it will help to create new jobs that you'll be in the future, instead of just putting all the money to save companies that anyway were obsolete, anyway were just taking us to an unsustainable world. And by creating jobs, of course, you address some of the questions that I mentioned at the beginning, which is by creating new jobs, by creating these big projects, and sometimes just by reorganizing the way revenue, income, wealth is distributed, and how people are compensated by their work and the opportunities that are open to them. You also address the question of how you distribute the gains of productivity, which is what really transformed the 20th century, when people decide, starting in the US with the New Deal, etc., and then after the Second World War, and in Europe, we got everybody participating. You don't have to be a pure consumer economy, but you get everybody participating in the action, expanding their horizon, living with more freedom too. Because when you get people that are happy, that are able to express themselves, the kind of divisive policies that we've seen in some places that link surveillance with really bad messages of fear, of suspicion that in some places have become the norm for some politicians, this will not prosper. So I think that these three big issues that I'm sure you're all familiar, we've all been talking about, they are interconnected. And if you address with ambition these questions, we can have a generation, your generation, my daughter's generations, living in a much better world, experiencing everything that you can do, in spite of all the challenges. Humanity always had challenges. We'll continue to have challenges of population in some places. We have good angels, but sometimes you also have bad angels. These will not disappear, but we can have an organization, a global mindset that can be of hope, of well-being, of justice, and also that ultimately will determine the survival of our species in this very, very small world, very fragile world that we live. So I just draw this, outline that to share a little bit my mindset. And let's now explore how these things translate in our lives. And for this, I'd love to hear your questions and how this resonates with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Levy, for being with us here today and for highlighting these three main drivers of the next normal. So what's going to happen now? We are going to have a first block of questions that I'll be addressing you, questions that were elaborated by our MBA students. And afterwards, I will hand it over to Andrea, who's going to develop another questions. And afterwards, we have a Q&A section with the questions that are being selected from the audience. So can we get started?
Yes.
Okay, so let's do it. So when it comes to the COVID-19 situation, it's for sure a health crisis, but it's fastly developing it in economic one as well. Some governments and politicians are seen to be posing this as a dichotomy. We'd like to know what's your perspective on that? What is the correlation between these two aspects of this crisis?
Well, it's not really a dichotomy. Of course, especially if you don't have the means to deal with this different type of crisis, this would have an economic impact. I think in many countries, this could have been reduced if you had a more clear strategy. You see that in Asia, in many countries, even in Australia, New Zealand, we had to have a short-term big stop, but then you have the testing, you have the personal protection equipment, you have the protocols and so on, so you can restart your life. And I think we have to learn how to live your life. So there's not a dichotomy. What is unacceptable is just to throw people without preparation to get exposed. Now, this is one thing. We have to have these strategies, this communication with people, and it's feasible, and it'll be tracking, temperature, testing, all of these things we know, but we're part caught by surprise, and in some places the answer was faster, in others it's taking a long time. The second thing, of course, is that the economy, global economy, local economy, is all about connections. So if you have an isolation, these connections are broken, not completely, but you have to find ways to keep the wheel turning. And there is where this distinction for you who are MBA is very clear, distinction between liquidity and solvency has to be addressed. And often a business, if it faces a liquidity issue and this liquidity issue is not addressed, then it can become insolvent. So the rapid answer to ensure that the people who, the business who didn't get the revenues can get some temporary revenue so they don't die. This is extremely important, because the most difficult thing is like a debt or anything. If you break a business, to put all these pieces together is extremely difficult. So I don't know, in the US, they had taken this situation where fire a lot of people, and if you close a lot of business, it's easier to open a business in the US, but still maybe there is some wisdom in Europe, where you don't want to preserve that business that may become obsolete, but you don't going to have a mass killing of business. So no dichotomy. You have to have some rules, you have to develop some procedures, some protocols, and you have to keep the business alive so that when we come out, the economy can go back relatively quickly.
Oh, thank you very much. Building on that idea of keeping the economy alive, so basically a lot of short-term measurements are being taken out just to keep the boat floating. But these short-term measures might have an effect in the long term. So I would like to know, how can we balance these two? How is the right way to go for one, but without jeopardizing the other so much?
Look, here is a very important consideration, because, of course, you, in a way, became poor because during 2 or 3 months, the production, the supply decreased. Okay, this is a shock. This will not make us poor forever if you don't destroy the business connections. Although you can say, like what I mentioned at the beginning, that until you have a vaccine, some of the things will not be able to come back. So you may be poor in a way, in a permanent way, because certain businesses will not come back. But I think it is more important to be aware of the structural changes. We've been talking about the fourth, industrial revolution, what do you mean by jobs and all of that for the last 5 years, okay? And in some countries, this has advanced quite a lot. In China, there's a huge transformation with that. I think that the COVID accelerated this, and it would mean that when you come back, there will be this hard choice of thinking of what kind of business will come back and what will never come back because of a structural technological change. And then what do you do with the people who are there, with the owners of this business? What kind of opportunities are there, which is what I said, how you share this, because the technological thing is potentially an increase in productivity, but it only multiplies if you have the ways for as many people as possible to participate, share in this game, and also become more productive.
Okay, it's definitely a big challenge ahead of all of us, but we are going to hope that we can make the most out of it. So I'd like to move forward now to a more macro topic. You mentioned the idea of a global village. So much is being said about the COVID-19 situation affecting our globalized world. Some people are concerned that we're going to start to facing a deglobalization, and maybe countries are going to develop a more protectionist economy, or maybe we're going to see some more war trades arising due to the focus on develop their own economies and save their own scenarios. So we'd like to know, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, globalization was great in terms of providing an integration of the world after the fall of communism. Whenever you have trade, the frictions are slower. The way it was conducted sometimes was a little bit too laissez-faire, and it's created a problem in some of the countries. It was not because of globalization per se, but because of a lot of things that were done and that were not done. Again, we knew about this, we discussed about this, and here in the US, there are big examples, in Europe too. So this movement was already happening. And I think what the COVID showed is that sometimes when you go too fast to increase your productivity or your profits, you become fragile. And so people will become more, risk averse in terms of expending too much their say, supply chains. This is not bad. This might mean, for instance, that you might want more suppliers, which is also good in many ways. I've been telling people in my own country, in Brazil, it's a great opportunity for Brazil to jump in. You have a good industry. We never really care to become a global, say, supplier. I think it's a good moment. And we can do this at the same time that other countries adjust. Some of the things will be brought onshore, probably, also with the new technologies and also with the new patterns of consumption. This would make sense. So I think that, of course, if you don't get to just polarization, just for fight, there are great opportunities of global cooperation and of a globalization that probably can be more balanced in some ways than what you saw in the last 25, 30 years.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to have the idea of a possibility of having a better globalization. Let's put it in this way. Maybe we can learn from all this crisis. So now I'm going to pass the floor to André, who's going to continue showing some questions. André?
Thank you, Maria Clara. Thank you, Dr. Levy. It has been a pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. Now I want to address the outlook of post-COVID situation in our region, in Latin America. So just a few days ago, we heard from World Health Organization that Latin America is the new epicenter of COVID. So Dr. Levy, I really want to know, how long would you expect for the recovery of the region?
Look, I'm not a medical doctor or a epidemiologist, so I be careful on what we say. I've been talking today with some people in the Amazon region, and they're talking how widespread the COVID is there. Many people have seen, for instance, in their offices, 30, 50% of people being, say, having the contagion. So it's quite widespread. Of course, these people have some resistance because you had a number of other things, the dengue and all sorts of things, but still they're feeling, and some places where you didn't have infrastructure, like in Manaus, has been really, really hard. And let me say something. I think that this month has shown what the true heroes are. I think that everybody in the healthcare sector have been really heroes in the real sense of the word. People who will take a risk on their own life to help others, to make a difference, to respond to society. I think these, in many ways, are even more heroes than people who go to war. But there are people that really at another level, and I think it's really inspiring. And sometimes we're so used with our own little problems, thinking about our own life, that when you see a huge number of people doing this as part of their profession, but going beyond their duty, it's really, I think, something that you have to applaud, have to admire, and really bring to our lives. Now, in Latin America, I think, again, it's a question of COVID accelerating certain issues. For many countries, of course, the drop in commodity prices because of the crisis has been very strong. In Brazil, fortunately, we depend a lot on food commodities, and these actually, the prices have been increasing, in part because something that is related to COVID, but is happening in China, which has to do with actually the swine fever. They're changing the way they produce pork. They have stopped the production by small farmers in conditions that were not, say, industrialized. They want all the pork food now be at industrial level. It means that you cannot feed the pork with waste. You have to buy feeding material, and this has created an increase in demand for corn, for soybeans, in spite of also the competition with the US. But when you think about oil, and Colombia, Brazil depend on oil, and when you think about copper and so on, it's a big challenge. But more than this, it's a challenge of this new new economy. In Brazil, one of the big things is, of course, retail. We had a lot of people, some of them, many of them, informal, in low productivity jobs, but that really made the whole economy. And these were the ones that were suffering the most. And the same in other countries. How this will, say, recover afterwards is a big question. And in a world where knowledge will be ever more important, we in Latin America, we have to focus even more in improving our educations, in giving more opportunities to the new generation, because this will be essential to the welfare. And I always say that we are too few in Latin America. We have less than 1 billion people in the whole, from Mexico to the Patagonia. So we have to have every one of us accounting and participating and being able to develop themselves. It's still far from what you see in many places, including in Brazil, but has to be our guiding value in how we redesign the economies. One final thought. Latin America, except for a few exceptions, in the last 20 years, have actually shown a good amount of a good macro management. This is why we survived the 2008 crisis and so on, in addition with the impact of the counter, say, cyclical policies of China and the US and Europe of lose money and a lot of demand for say, raw material, but also we had a good management. I think this time is a big challenge because we have weaker fiscal conditions to have a huge, say, fiscal intervention of government, but people are aware of what has to be done. And like I said, if you use the money just for a short period of time to address the liquidity, and then if you really are very focused and parsimonious on how you do to change the economy, bring back the medium-term recovery of the economy, you can do that without, say, ruining your fiscal, even if in the short run you have a jump in the debt to GDP ratio.
Thank you. You mentioned, it's interesting because you mentioned education, you mentioned these long and medium term opportunities, but I want to ask you, is there any opportunities in the short term that these countries can do in order to ramp out of the crisis?
Well, in the short term, I think that first you have to try to preserve business. You have to continue, and there are different levels, but continue to distribute money, ensure that also people are okay. I think that in most countries, and in particular in Brazil, the central bank has been effective in providing credit and the guarantees, because the banks cannot take a huge amount of risk. They can do the money, but the government has to take some of this risk. And then you have to focus on how to use the crisis to change a few things. It's in the time that you are shaken that sometimes you have the political courage to change something. In Brazil, for instance, sorry to keep coming back to Brazil, there are a few reforms. We have a huge problem, for instance, of sanitation, but it's an area where the private sector can do a lot. The presence of the public sector is important, but there are a lot of that can be done by the private sector. You need to have a framework, you need to have the regulations that allow the private sector to have the clarity to come in. I'm sure in Colombia, there are a lot of things that you can do in the short term at the same time that you prepare for permanent change. In Colombia, revenues from fossil fuels are extremely important. They're almost 50%. If you see all the different aspects of it, coal, oil, natural gas, and so on, extremely important. Okay, from the fiscal point of view, you have to start to think how to replace it. It's a little bit sad what is happening in Mexico. There are their own reasons for that, but I think that some countries are really looking forward. I know Costa Rica is taking the opportunity and making inquiries about, for instance, how to use hydrogen, which is, I think, something that would be very important for Europe and for other countries. They want to do that because they want to become net zero carbon emission country as soon as possible. And hydrogen, of course, with solar energy, you'll be part of the solution for that. So we have to bring these things also to the table and start to work on that. And why this is important? Because for one, I believe that when people see an objective, they start to have hope. And hope is fundamental to have consumer confidence. If you are too much worried about the future, if you see that your government has no idea what to do next, or a plan for 5 years, even if it's in 5 years, you will be extremely careful. You're not going to buy anything. Many of the millennials are saying, well, I hung with the little money that I have, because if I have €1,000, I don't know when I'm going to get another €1,000. And then this is what makes the economy to stop. It's not only the COVID, it's the lack of perspectives.
Well, this is very insightful. Thank you again, Dr. Levy. Now I'll pass the stage to Victor, who will keep the next stage of our event.
Thank you, Andre. Now we'll move forward with some questions from the Esade community and our colleagues around the world. They have been sending them, and we will try to cover the biggest range of topics. You mentioned retail and the airlines. How can governments in the private sector ensure that these stimulus and these debt restructurings translate into long-term gains?
Look, I'll make a little provocation, because we are in a strange situation where, of course, you cannot go to the streets and make ourselves heard, let alone listen to. But I think that's a good challenge for you, for instance, on how we can make our views more forcefully heard at this time. Because ultimately, the way for governments to react is that they see a huge pressure. There are countries where we're going to have elections. The US is one of these countries. How much you really can mobilize during this period? This is particularly important for the young people, because you, like I mentioned at the beginning, you'll be facing the consequences of decisions taken today, 50 years from now, okay, for your whole life and the lives of your kids. So I think that we have to think very hard to make sure that the time of isolation is not a time where people mistakenly will think that they can do whatever and nobody's watching, nobody will react, and there will be no pressure. Because of course, if there is no pressure, if those who are going to bear the consequences don't get very active now, yeah, people sometimes you make the easiest solutions. So let's save the airline, but put no options. Now, airlines can do a lot just by deciding to really be serious about, for instance, biofuels. We can produce biofuels in a very sustainable way. Of course, biofuels are sometimes produced in ways where you destroy the forest, but there are ways of doing without destroying the forest. In Brazil itself, we have a huge opportunity with palm oil, which is African tree that we all use for eating, dendê. It's extremely productive. In contrast with some other cultures, actually, it's best grown in small farms. You can have large farms, but it's something also that is not automated, the harvest. So it means that it employs a lot of people. And actually, you can produce very good biokerosene with that will reduce the footprint of airplanes dramatically if you did that. Now, this is also you create jobs and opportunities in poor countries. What is the point of just giving aid if you don't open opportunities? And they mentioned hydrogen with solar energy. This is another way of creating a huge new market that would displace and maybe in the future replace the oil market by producing hydrogen through electricity, electrolysis in countries where you have a good sunshine, and then sending these to countries that need energy. It's much cleaner than natural gas, which is not that clean, and can create a whole new links between tropical poor economies and, for instance, Europe. You get to a cleaner world also distributing the gaining productivity that we get by producing energy just through sunlight instead of having to go to the most stringent place and spend huge amount of money to extract oil. So that's, if you who are business people, if you think in terms of careers, how are you going to be part of that? And also in terms of how you put pressure today to governments so they make these right choices. I think this is the way to go. And I'm sure that there will be, say, some digital way to mobilize people, to make the voice heard. We've seen since almost 10 years now, 2013, and even before, how digital networks can help organize people. Well, we can make a green day where people could talk from their houses, make mentions, and organize a common movement through their houses through digital networks. This is the kind of things that will make a difference, that you make your generation and everybody who cares about the world, who cares about jobs and the recovery, be heard in a time where, of course, governments are under a lot of pressures. And if they don't feel pressure from us, they respond for those who are their door, knocking their door with good people in beautiful suits and so on, and ties and so on. So we have to be part of what's going on these days.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Energy obviously seems to be a great path for opportunity. What other knowledge-based exports can you envision for Latin America to help in this recovery? Knowledge-based services that we could sell abroad?
Well, everything. I think that these days, look, of course, there are regulatory barriers to this. But for instance, you have great doctors. Even if the productivity of all the American doctors increase, there are a lot of things that maybe people can do through, say, digital consultations. Just one thing, okay? Of course, you need a framework so that people feel confident. You may need an aggregator so that people have the trust that when they go to the internet, we know all the fake news. They don't want to have fake doctors. But if you get something with the reputation, you can do the same way you got the Expedia. If you think there's so many things that have become. In Brazil, for instance, actually, I think that one of the main aggregators of hotels is actually an Argentinian company. So I think hotels. So of course it requires capital, but I think that we can compete. This will be the new competition. And even if we know that in the digital world, there is the issue of the winner takes it all, we may have to also make political pressure to avoid that these natural monopolies become real monopolies and the wealth is not, say, distributed. But this is the kind of thing we can provide any type of service. We are already in video games and so on. Of course, you have to be aware of the importance of capital, and the lack of savings in most of the Latin American countries continues to be a serious issue. But I think that there are many areas where we can provide value. And then, of course, the natural products will continue to be important. And if you use technology to produce these things on a sustainable way, it's quite amazing. There are fruits that are very specific to Latin America. We have to fight hard to open markets for that. I'm sure that people will be more and more linked to the earth, and these are kind of things that we can also be competitive. And there are good examples, the same way Chile and Argentina became so famous for wines. We can do similar things with other products, and these will be products that will be valuable and valued by consumers in the future.
Well, I see. Out of all of these areas, if you had to suggest one thing that our MBA class or those MBAs watching us from across the world could head into to start having an immediate impact, what would you suggest?
Well, in the immediate impact, you have to think who is close to you. I mean, there are ways, in poor neighborhoods and are the ones who are suffering more. If you can find ways to depending on how much you're linked to also to put together, you know how to put together platforms, but anything that will bring people closer, will allow more dissemination of information, could have a direct impact. We have good examples of that. Otherwise, I mean, it's up to the imagination of yourselves in any of these business lines that I mentioned to find opportunities. And
I
I'm
hope
sure many of you achieve that.
Well, Dr. Levy, I wanted to thank you on behalf of everyone for your insights. I wanted to also thank Professor Luis Vives for giving us the support to host this event. And I wanted to thank you all for being here and contributing to this conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me and for the provocation. I think some of your questions, you make me think harder on things that we can do also immediately, especially young people, but highly trained people like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. I completely agree. We should listen more to the questions that our young and very well-prepared students have to ask us. And I was taking a lot of notes about some of the drivers that you pointed out in this conversation from the labor and income changes that are going to happen and how to distribute the gains in productivity that we can expect, to the area of artificial intelligence, how is it going to change our lives, and the privacy issues that may come linked to it, and last but not least, the topic of climate change. But I would like to take also the opportunity to leverage one of the final words that you were mentioning to Andre, Victor, and Maria Clara. You were talking about the importance of imagination. I think this is certainly something that is going to be very, very important. I would like to close this session by once again saying thank you so much to Dr. Levy. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and muchas gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias. And this couldn't have been possible without the work of our MBA students, and specifically the Latin American Business Club. So in that respect, we would like to close by saying thank you so much to the Latin American Business Club. They were doing a lot of work and preparation. Thank you once again to Victor, Andre, and Maria Clara for the fantastic questions and the great management of this session. It's truly a pleasure to have great speakers like you, Dr. Levy, and also great interviewers like our MBA students. Once again, stay connected with Esade, and we look very much forward to seeing you soon in our next webinars. Thank you.
Adeu.
Muito obrigado.